The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Thursday, May 1st. This evening, we've got a guest. I'm really thrilled to have Phil Magness here. Am I pronouncing that right?
Oh, that is correct. Happy to be here.
Great. Phil is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute out in California, although he doesn't live there. He's the David Theroux Chair in Political Economy. He's served as a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, as an academic program director at the Institute for Humane Studies, and an adjunct professor of public policy in the School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason. And he received his Ph.D. at the George Mason University School of Public Choice. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, put aside of trade, George Mason School of Public Policy, is it as free market oriented as the economics department is?
Unfortunately, no. There is some history where some free market professors that had been involved in the economics department did teach there at the time that I went there, but it's a very typical political science department, I'd say, these days.
Okay. That's too bad.
Yeah.
But you got the benefit of
exactly. It was there at the right time and at a very good moment, and it's yielded.
So I figured today, what I'd like to start with is talking a little bit about the history. There's a lot of confusion and I think a lot of misinformation out there about the history, American economic history, and of course the Trump administration justified the tariffs as raving about the 19th century,
Right.
and so I'm curious. So the founding fathers, I mean, really in the early part of the republic, early 19th century, the government was mostly funded by tariffs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Looking back and doing kind of the economic analysis of that, was that a good idea, bad idea, and how can we tell?
Yeah, so it is something that originates with the very first revenue system of the United States. So remember, that's one of the major reasons why they bring together the Constitutional Convention, is to get a national tax system for the full government of the country. Previous to that, it was based on state contributions that they would send, sometimes voluntarily, other times they wouldn't pay at all. But the idea was set up a national tax system, and a tariff became appealing because it was the easiest system to enforce. Involves very low level of administrative state. You just have to set up customs houses at the ports and basically collect at ports of entry. This is something historical. We see in any state that has very low capacity to collect taxes, tariffs tend to be one of the favored mechanisms. And that's what we got. It was also kind of enshrined in the Constitution as one of the enumerated tax powers. There were restrictions at the time. You could not tax income directly. So it's before the 16th Amendment. So really the first revenue system in the U.S., it's usually about 50%, if not higher, of federal taxes come in are taxes on imports. They're tariffs. Remainders kind of split between like excises on alcohol and tobacco and usual things like that. But it's the dominant tax system up until 1913.
Was a sale tax really impractical in a sense that you couldn't track it?
Right. Because you couldn't do, I mean, the tracking of it would be nearly impossible, especially at that time in history. I mean, you'd have to have a revenue agent in every little town collecting, taxes on sales. Whereas the port of entry, you have a manifest of all the goods that are on board the ship. You can calculate a price based on that. You can calculate how much of a percentage goes to the tax. And to unload at the dock in the port, you go to the customs collector and you get stamped for approval or stamped to enter it into a warehouse. And that basically means it's legitimate.
And was there thriving, smuggling business as a consequence?
There was, especially very early on. And there was a great concern at the Constitutional Convention that, if they raised the tariff too high, it would encourage smuggling. especially if you get you've got this wide open frontier.
Hmm.
You've got the Mississippi River that a lot of ports of entry on that and places that you could unload things overnight. Of course, as the country develops more, that tendency towards smuggling goes down. But it's certainly in the back of their minds very early on.
And what were kind of the rates early on?
So they initially intended it to be relatively low. James Madison proposes the very first tariff in 1789. It's one of the first bills that they put before Congress. They thought it was going to be like a very low uniform rate, and they left it blank on the bill. But Madison's letters say indicate that he thought it was going to be about 5%, just across the board on all imports. So it was like a de facto sales tax on imports.
Mhm.
But then the protectionist interests start getting in there and say, well, you can do 5% on everything else, but we have iron in our home district. Can you tax that at 10% and give us an advantage over our competitors abroad? So it's really the origin of special interest lobbying in Washington, D.C. as well is from these early tariff bills because they figure out that they can start varying the rates.
So how early, I mean, it was this really right at the beginning that the kind of the pressure groups start?
So they emerge in that very first bill, but it's a very light type of pressure group. It's only a couple percentage points higher than the base rate.
Okay.
You don't really get into the heavy protectionism that emerges as a philosophy in the 1820s. So the first, really about 30 years or so of the government's existence, it has a revenue tariff and a little bit of protection around the edges. And these are in times of peace. Of course, there's embargoes in times of war
Yeah.
that cut off trade. But in times of peace, the tariff is pretty low.
So, the Trump administration talks about a lot about the McKinley economy,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
McKinley tariffs. This is the 1890s, I take
Yes,
it.
exactly, exactly.
So tell us a little bit about the tariff and then what do they mean by the McKinley economy?
Yeah. And so after the American Civil War, actually, it's during the Civil War, a whole bunch of new tariffs come into play. Right on the eve of it, the Morrill Tariff Act is passed. And then during the war, there's a mixture of war finance measures, but also the special interests. They kind of realize, hey, if we're jacking up taxes for the war, we can also get our fingers involved in setting the rates and do something favorable. So really what happens is after the war is over, those interests are entrenched. They've become a part of the Washington fixture, and really for the remainder of the 19th century, they're there. Every time Congress revises the tariff schedule, it's like a call goes out to all the vultures, and they descend on the Capitol building and try to get their favorable rates. So William McKinley is a member of the House of Representatives. He's in Congress and becomes basically the architect of a major tariff revision. And this is in 1890. And the interesting thing about McKinley is he took an already pretty high protective crony entrenched tariff system that they had been fighting over for several decades. And he was seen as going into even excess beyond what Washington would tolerate. So there are several instances of this in the 19th and early 20th centuries as Congress overreaches and instead of just like feigning that they're going to do a revenue revision with a little bit of protection on the side, it's just open the doors wide to all the special interests to come in. McKinley does that in 1890. You get a really cronyist increase in the tariff schedule, and there's huge voter backlash against it. People are basically kind of disgusted. They throw the Republican Party out of office in the next election. The same pattern repeats itself in 1909 with the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Um, you may recognize the name Nelson Aldrich. He's the architect of the Federal Reserve.
Yep.
He's also an arch protectionist senator from Rhode Island. And he did the same thing McKinley did 2 decades earlier in 1909. And there's such a heavy backlash against it. The Republicans get thrown out of office in the next two elections, and the income tax amendment is ratified to be an alternative to the tariff system.
So,
So
so I don't know if people know this, but it's the Republican Party that is the party of tariffs
absolutely in
in
that era.
in the 19th century and early 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. That comes out of the deep history. They kind of grew from the Whig Party
Mhm.
and the Henry Clay wing of the Whig Party. And Henry Clay, you go all the way back in 1824, he is the father of American protectionism. He's the first to really drive and make this major push for, well, we should have tariffs not just for revenue. We should basically design the industrial future of the economy, centrally plan the economy, and we use tariffs as one of the levers to do that. He also likes central banks. He also likes public subsidies. He's in favor of all these mass infrastructure expenditures on building ports and then eventually canals and railroads, and wants the government's hand in everything.
So when did the Democrats and Republicans flip?
Yeah, yeah. So that's it's after World War II, really. So the Republicans are the high tariff party all the way through the 1920s, and they made the major mistake in the outset of the Great Depression.
Hmm.
So the stock market crashes, and they went back to the Henry Clay playbook, and that said that if you're in a recession, your stimulus package is to lock down America, to build up walls around the economy from competition with the rest of the world, and weather the recession. So after the stock market crash, they passed the Smoot-Hawley Act, and it's just a catastrophic backfire. It starts a trade war with all of our major trading partners, and they retaliate against us. At a time the U.S. economy is already faltering. Our major export at that era was agricultural goods, and the agricultural economy of the Midwest and the Great Plains is not in great shape. At the outset of the Depression, while all these other countries start putting tariffs on it, it just leads to a domino effect
Hmm.
that cascades across the center of the country, and then next thing you know, you got farm mortgage defaults and runs on banks, and just a catastrophe after catastrophe. So it's 4 years of this go by. Republicans get swept out of office in 1932 for both this mistake. They did another thing. They tried to raise income tax rates to balance the budget. Contractionary fiscal policy in the middle of a depression,
Yep.
not a good idea either. So it's like a double mistake, but they get thrown out of office for it with good reason. And FDR, for all of his problems, one of the few things he did right, he appointed a Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who's an old free trade Democrat. And
Hmm.
Cordell Hull basically gets Congress to pass a series of package of legislation that allows the executive branch to negotiate its way out of Smoot-Hawley.
Huh.
So it's turn it over to the State Department. He says he's basically saying, Congress, you screwed up. Empower the State Department to seek reciprocal trade agreements with other countries, and we'll pass them through Congress. This sets everything into motion. So after World War II, return of peace, they settle on the GATT agreement, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs,
Hmm.
which is an extension of this Cordell Hull philosophy on the Democratic Party side. The switch starts to emerge really in the 1950s when the Democrats become kind of the pro-labor interest.
Yeah.
They're propping up labor unions, and what do labor unions want? Well, protection for the home industry. And Republicans start shifting over into just a more general free market philosophy. Imperfect, but nonetheless, it's like a backlash against the interventions of the New Deal. So by the mid 20th century, the two parties have gone in the other directions. By the end of the 20th century, in the Reagan era and beyond,
Yeah.
like the leading protectionists are Dick Gephardt. If anyone remembers him, he was the House leader on the Democratic side for
Mhm.
most of the 1990s, and he was like this arch protectionist. We need to put tariffs to prop up my labor unions back
Yep.
home in my district. Whereas the Republicans are, well, we've embraced the philosophy of free trade, at least nominally, and it generally negotiated this tendency toward lower tariffs worldwide.
All right, so we'll get to what the situation is today with the parties,
Yeah.
but I want to go back to McKinley. So there's a lot of talk about, look, we had tariffs
Yeah.
during that era, very high tariffs, much higher than we had in the 20th century, and the economy grew really fast, and productivity
Right.
increased, and things good, and they draw, a causal relationship
Exactly.
between the two. So what do we know? And how do we know it about the effect of tariffs on the economy
Yeah.
and how the economy grew in spite of the tariffs?
Yeah. Well, this is a very bizarre claim. As you said, they see correlation and they assume causation. Well, the tariffs must cause prosperity. I look at that era and I say, wait a minute, we had no central bank. We had very low regulatory environments around the federal government for sure, and also at the state level. No federal income tax, very low spending. We generally had a free and relatively open immigration system. We had just very few areas where the government was messing around in the economy. And yet they look at it and they say, of all those different things, tariffs must be the cause of this. It's frankly insane.
Mhm.
The level of causality. It's like they glommed onto this one policy that they happen to like, and therefore they assert that it must be the reason for prosperity. Well, the reality is much more complicated than that. You look at the industries that grew in that era, and it's a time of very heavy technological innovation. Electricity has been basically converted into something that's useful. It's no longer just a quirk of science. It is now something that you can run machinery on. Electrification is taking place. Transportation has taken off in leaps and bounds. And that's everything from the steamships to railroads to new means of transport, eventually the automobile. All of this starts to come into play between really the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century. So it's a very vibrant time in the U.S. economy. And what you do, if you look at all these different industries that are growing, there's a general upward trajectory in growth, but you can compare industries that are relatively insulated from trade and tariffs. So like electricity, they didn't
Yep.
really have a way to
Yep.
put electricity under a tariff at that time. The energy sector, there's really not any way to do that. And yet you compare that against like certain types of steel production. And it turns out that the non-tariffed industries, their rate of growth is faster than the tariffed industries. So you wouldn't expect that. If tariffs are the cause, they would say that the steel industry should be the fastest growing thing in America, not the electricity sector. And you also see other effects that especially like very heavy machinery, heavy capital goods. There's some evidence that the tariffs on those prevented the importation of machinery from Europe at that time, and it actually puts a drag on some of the industrial sector. So you start comparing sector by sector, digging beneath the surface, and this tariff argument, it just doesn't hold up. I mean, it's a flimsy, like post hoc rationalization of a policy they like for other reasons.
Yep. And what was the justification at the time? I mean, at the time were economists, I mean, this is post
Yeah.
Wealth of Nations, post Ricardo. Are there economists defending this, or is this pure
Yeah.
political economy? Is this pure cronyism?
Yeah, so there are a few economists that are defending it. They're in the minority, although unfortunately they're based in the United States. So Henry C. Carey is probably the preeminent protectionist economist of the 19th century U.S.
Mhm.
And he comes out of this Henry Clay tradition that we need to centrally plan certain areas of production. And his whole thing is we need to harmonize the interests of the country. The agriculture sectors need to supply raw materials to the industrial sectors, which sell their goods to, it's like this whole, you imagine him as like this, he's almost like a Rand villain sitting there in a room trying to manipulate
Yep. Yep.
everything and centrally plan through a bureau. And this guy was addicted to tariffs. Like every time a problem came along, he said, "Oh, tariffs will solve that." Even, and I'm not making this up, on the eve of the Civil War, he says, "Well, slavery is a problem. Tariffs will solve that." So it's like tariffs are his only tool. Then everything looks like it's a protected industry.
Yeah.
So you do get that, but by the mid to late 19th century, the economics profession has swung completely in the Adam Smith, David Ricardo direction. There are very few academic economists that are arguing for tariffs. William Graham Sumner is emerging as kind of one of the leaders of the American economics profession. He's a laissez-faire free trade guy, basically, by
Mhm.
background. And what you get is the academic economists are all saying, this policy that you've adopted, it's harming the economy. But they knew and they recognized at the time they weren't going up against competing economists. They were going up against industrial special interest groups. They were going up against really a sector, a concentrated political sector in the Northeast that was a heavy beneficiary of the tariffs, and they dispersed their costs onto the rest of the country. And this is why it's unfortunately it's why we get an income tax, because the tariff system was seen as extremely unfair. It was onerous on the entire country just to prop up the industrial sector of the Northeast. And people got so sick of the cronyism, they were like, well, we need to try something new. And they floated the income tax. It's like, well, you can have an income tax that applies nationwide. And at least that would be more equitable, was the idea. And Sumner, even, I mean, he's a laissez-faire guy, even endorses the income tax proposal at this point because he thinks the tariff is so insidious.
Yeah. And it's still true that sales taxes are still too difficult to collect, I see.
Exactly, exactly.
And so, but then we get the income tax and we get Smoot-Hawley. So we got,
Exactly. So that was
as
the
usual, we
mistake.
get them all.
Yeah, yeah. So they amended the Constitution to create a new tax. They didn't amend it at the same time to bar the old tax.
Yep.
So yeah, and that's the problem. You try to swap one for the other, you end up with the worst of both worlds. You end up with high income taxes and high tariffs, and they learned that unfortunately the hard way.
Was there a, credible alternative to the tariff in the 19th century, given the size of government? You didn't have to raise that much revenue.
Yeah, yeah.
What could have been an alternative to it?
Well, there are some experiments with a very low stable tariff.
Hmm.
They occur. So the most notable ones in 1846 under the Polk administration. He comes into office like basically saying we're going to repeal the Whig tariff agenda, and he succeeds largely.
Hmm.
So for basically between then and the start of the Civil War, tariffs are relatively low, and there's some successive reductions in the rate. It's a time of high commerce, especially with Britain, which had just repealed its corn laws the same
Yep.
year.
Yep.
So you start to get an integrated global economy from that, and it's sufficient to meet basically most of the revenue needs of the federal government.
Was Grover Cleveland good on the issue of tariffs?
Yeah, yeah. So Cleveland was actually one of the great articulators of free trade. The problem he runs into is every time he attempted a tariff reform, the lobbyist would descend and they'd carve up his bill and reinstitute kind of through the back door the higher rates that they had previously enjoyed under McKinley and some of the other tariffs of that era. So there's a very famous incident, the Wilson-Gorman tariff that comes in under the Cleveland administration, and it does reduce rates, but it had been so bogged down in all of this cronyism that Cleveland basically lets it become law without his signature because
Oh,
he doesn't
so
want to be
that's fine.
associated with that.
Yeah. And who are the major cronies in this time? What industries are
So it's always the steel and iron industry. They're the infant industry of America since 1789, and they've never grown up. It's the which is
so even under
it's this.
Carnegie and these giants of industry, they're still crony?
There's quite a bit of it, and it's actually a lot of the smaller firms,
Okay.
in particular. Bethlehem Steel was a major steel producer for
Yep.
hundreds of years in the
Yep.
United States, and basically the entirety of its existence is spent sending lobbyists to Washington, D.C. to get favorable steel rates. So you got that sector. Textiles in New England are another big one. A lot of mill towns and things like that, including companies that no longer exist,
Sure.
were deeply involved in the tariff schedule. And you can go back and read some of the letters like when Nelson Aldrich is revising the tariff, or Justin Murrill or William McKinley. In their archives, there are letters, and there are all these little firms sending, um, uh, say, here's the desired rate schedule that we would like. By the way, would you like a free sample of our product? And by the way, I'm sending someone else as well to come talk to you, and there's probably a bag of money being exchanged under the table.
Well, today they just have to buy a meme coin, so
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
much easier today. So take us. One other question about this, Smoot-Hawley. So I just read William Bernstein's book
Yeah,
on
yeah.
trade, its history of trade, and he makes the argument in that book that Smoot-Hawley didn't really have that big of an impact on the Great Depression, and he kind of presents it as Great Depression was caused by the Fed, and most economists
Yeah.
today think that Smoot-Hawley had very little impact. Is that your understanding? Do you think that's true?
I push back on that. So I certainly wouldn't claim that Smoot Hawley caused the depression. I mean, the
Yep.
timeline just doesn't work.
Sure.
Because it's a reaction to other things. Uh, there's definitely monetary mismanagement that
Yep.
is probably the main original trigger of the depression, and
Mhm.
that monetary mismanagement continues for several years. They're basically operating in a contractionary monetary situation at
Oops, you're frozen. All right. Hopefully, we'll get you back in a minute. We're talking to Phil about the Great Depression. You guys on the chat?
some reason I might
Oh,
have. There we
yeah,
are.
you
We're
froze
back.
again.
Yeah, yeah,
So
froze
you were
up.
saying
Sorry about that.
you're talking about the monetary contraction as being the
Yeah,
initial cause, and that it went on for many years. Uh,
yeah. So basically, what Smoot Hawley does is it throws gasoline on.
yeah. Hmm. Not sure what's going on with Phil's internet connection. It's going kind of in and out. Am I stuck or is Phil stuck? Who is frozen? Okay. Oh, you're back.
Yeah,
Back again.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, normally it's a very good connection. So yeah, but you've got an international, you've got a national federal banking policy with the Federal Reserve, monetary contraction. Throw gasoline on the fire by igniting a trade war. And what the trade war does, because it's so retaliatory, it basically helps to spread the depression worldwide. So it worsens conditions in basically all countries that partake in it. So you've got that one effect. The second effect, it has acute harms on specific export industries,
Mhm.
both because they're price takers from the tariff and they're also operating on a now hostile world market where other countries are retaliating against them. And if your agriculture sector is your main export sector, and that's getting just battered down by retaliatory tariffs abroad, you're in really bad shape. So
And you're
that's
going
why
to
you get
see.
an acute depression within a depression in
Yep.
the farm sector.
Yep. So the post World War II, there was this shift towards free trade,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
beginning of a shift towards free trade. How much of this is guided by the economists and the intellectuals who understand this phenomena, or is it just
Yeah.
again a kind of political response?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, if we say that Cordell Hull's the architect of it, Hull was a very adept politician, but he also understood free trade.
Hmm.
He's someone that you go back to some of his congressional speeches in the early 1900s, and he's quoting Frank William Taussig, William Graham Sumner, even Adam Smith, David Ricardo. He's very aware of free trade economics and the theory behind what he was arguing. So it's a surprisingly literate moment in our political history that I think we've lost. And then at the same time, you have events,
All right, lost Phil again. Let's see. Hopefully, it'll be short. Uh, yeah, those ISPs in Virginia. I don't know. It seems like Puerto Rico's more stable.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've never had this on this computer. It's uh
Huh.
okay. I think it's back. Or is it
Yeah, you're
frozen
back.
again?
You're back.
Yep. Yeah. So you have the Bretton Woods Conference that takes place in 1944, and although we remember it for international exchange rate systems and
Hmm.
all of the issues with that, one of the things it spawns is a subsequent agreement, the GATT agreement in 1947. And in a way, this is weirdly, is John Maynard Keynes is one of the major influences on
Hmm.
this. And he's recognizing some of the failures of trade during the Great Depression. And it's like, how do we put it on a more stable global footing? And that's he steers toward this type of an agreement. So there are certainly economists that are in the discussion there that are making those arguments when the GATT emerges in 1947.
And what's the effect? I mean, that is, so we start in 1947 and we take it out until let's say 2016.
Yeah, yeah.
What happens to tariffs around the world?
Yeah, it's a precipitous decline. It's the most sustained period of trade liberalization in human history.
Well,
And it starts with the original signers of the GATT, and basically they adopt terms very similar to what Hull had adopted in the United States in 1934. Even some of the language is carried over, and it's to provide a platform for countries to come together and offer reciprocal reductions in their barriers to trade. And this takes place over several successive rounds through the 1950s and 60s. But the aim of each is to lower barriers piecemeal, but the trajectory is all downward. And you can see it in like the average tariff rate of the world and of most major economies. They emerged from the World War II era with medium to high tariffs. Some are still holdovers from the Smoot-Hawley trade war. Then by the 1990s, early 2000s, you start getting in the territory where like the average tariff rate of a typical country is 5% or less. So very,
okay.
very small. You continue that all the way up to the present day, and it turns out like most developed countries have average tariff rates between like 0 and 3%. So very, very small piecemeal tariffs. There are a few exceptions. There's always a crony interest that wants like dairy or sugar or something protected. But by and large, very, very free trade up until the 2010s.
And to what extent, when does China integrate into all of this system?
Yeah,
And
so they start joining into the discussions of free trade in the late 1990s and then early 2000s. They enter in as a member of the WTO.
and there's all this talk about the fact that, oh, China has high tariffs.
Yeah.
How much truth is there to that?
Well, you can go on the World Bank's website. They have the comparative tariff rates between countries.
Hmm.
And then you can go on things like Economic Freedom of the World, or then the Heritage Foundation has its own similar index where they rank countries by how liberalized they are. China's only a few steps behind the United States on most of those rankings. It turns out now we're on the lower end of developed economies, and that's the other crazy thing. Like the European Union, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, all of these major trading partners actually had lower tariff rates prior to this current Trump trade war
Sure.
than the United States imposed upon others. And China's just a little bit behind us, but it certainly moved them as well in the free trade direction.
Hmm. Is
Um,
there, short of Peter Navarro, is there any kind of intellectual uh, justification for tariffs? Are there economists who actually believe tariffs are good?
Very, very few. I mean, there are people. So Paul Krugman, who is, to his credit, is generally a free trader.
Yeah.
He has discovered some theoretical scenarios where a tariff might be used in a leveraged way that improves the welfare of the society that imposes it. But then he comes and puts a caveat and says, but if you try to get that through the political system that we have, it's going to be captured by the interest groups.
Yep.
So it's better to not even try is essentially the message there. But these are also all theoretical curiosities. Now there's some parts of the foreign policy world that would argue tariffs are like a sanction tool.
Yep.
Although I'd counter that their sanctions in general are generally they're very ineffective in what
Hmm.
they do. And a tariff is no different than that because a lot of the incidents, the harm, is actually imposed on your own economy, not the country abroad.
Is there any examples in history of tariffs being used as a foreign policy tool that were effective?
Not really all that well. Thomas Jefferson tried with
Hmm.
the Embargo Act, and this is all in the lead up to the War of 1812 against the European powers and Britain in particular. They were doing some things, predation on the seas, impressing sailors, general hostility. And you thought, okay, well, we're going to put an embargo in place as like a punitive sanction. And what they discovered pretty quickly is that the cost of that is actually borne mostly by the domestic economy.
And that's an embargo, not even tariffs, right?
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's just we're going to try to sanction. I mean,
Yep.
it's the old analogy is like we put up blockades on our enemy's ports during war. This is like putting a blockade up on our own ports.
Hmm. So, so in the 2010s, what starts changing to change Americans' attitudes
Yeah.
towards tariffs?
So I guess a couple things. You have an ascendancy on the political left of a very aggressive, almost socialistic branch of the Democratic Party that was not there during the Clinton era or that was marginalized in the Clinton era. Because Clinton, for all of his other interventions, he's generally a free trade guy, with a
Mhm.
few exceptions. George W. Bush, with all of his problems, is generally a free trade guy, with a few exceptions, like he got lobbied by the steel industry and he was wanting to win the Rust Belt states when he was up for re-election, so he threw them a
I mean,
bone.
even Reagan caved to the
Exactly,
lobby.
exactly. But these are all the exceptions rather than the rule. Then in the early 2010s, you start getting this Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party that emerges. And it takes kind of like the old Dick Gephardt message and puts it on steroids. Elizabeth Warren, another example. These really, really far left, they're socialists, but they're like protectionist socialists. They want at the end of the day, they're just central planners. They want to plan the entire American
Yeah.
economy, and trade is one component of that. And they're like, oh, well, we also need to benefit the domestic industry. So that emerges on the left. It kind of unmoors the Democratic Party center from its previous commitment to free trade that emerged under Bill Clinton. And this is when you start getting like these crazy anti-WTO protests in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Those are a symptom of it as well. And they're basically like communists running around with masks on and smashing windows on the streets in Seattle. We all remember
I
all these
remember that.
riots and stuff. It's
Yeah.
the same type of a thing. So that faction emerges as the protectionist left. And then almost a reaction to that, you start getting the populist right. And this is it's a little bit later. It's kind of a lagging movement behind it. The only antecedent that was really pronounced was the Pat Buchanan movement in the 1990s.
Hmm.
But that had been a very small wing of the Republican Party. Buchanan was an old school, like 1920s style Republican protectionist that weirdly held over as this relic into the modern era. And some of his messaging got picked up by the Trump movement. And then you started seeing other people on the populist right. You see Senator Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio starts dabbling in this in the mid 2010s. Uh, these are more interventionist perspectives on economic policy than the Republican Party had been indulging up until that point. It's not just on tariffs that they do this margin. They also want industrial subsidies. Some of them also want to reinvigorate antitrust to break up companies they dislike. It's just the heavy hand of the state. It's just both right and left wing versions of government central planning are very conducive to this tariff ideology. And then Trump, who had always been a protectionist going back to like the 1970s and 80s,
Yep.
he emerges and he has a natural constituency in both of these groups and really kind of builds his presidency around that.
So one of the economic stories that seems to motivate these people quite a bit is, which I think started on the left, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
I started noticing it starting with the financial crisis, and that is this idea that what is it? The wages are stagnated, middle
right,
class
right.
is being hollowed out, middle class is shrinking, poverty is increasing, I guess, although they never quite say it. But
Yeah,
wages, life was better in the 70s, which is what the
right,
left says. And then the right says life was better in the 50s, but life was always better a long time ago.
right, right.
How do you see the evolution of that? And how did they, because they're obviously wrong and lying, how did it become today? It's like
Yeah,
everybody believes it, right?
yeah.
Everybody believes it. It's really hard to challenge.
Well, it's like the inequality myth, the myth that
Yep.
the 1% are running away. And that's intertwined with it as well. It's the perception that there are titans of industry that are doing great and everyone else is just scraping by. I think part of it, so it's a misdiagnosis of things like the financial crisis.
Hmm.
That's certainly, I mean, unfortunately, the message that was taken away. The financial crisis is basically a stacked succession of government blunders that caused that whole thing to happen. And it
Absolutely.
starts in the housing industry and it spreads elsewhere through just terrible regulatory incentives. And yet that story's been lost.
Well,
And
and mismanagement by the Federal Reserve is all.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
all the classic missteps that government could do. They did, and you got a financial crisis out of it. And yet somehow they've escaped culpability for that and shifted the blame and said, "Oh well." I mean, it's almost like this 1890s tariff narrative. Well, it's free trade must have caused that to happen. You look at the actual statistics. American industrial output. And you can go on the Federal Reserve St. Louis website right now. Look at American industrial output. It accelerates after NAFTA. It accelerates through the 2010s. Yes, it does suffer the same effect of the financial crisis as everyone else, but it
Mhm.
rebounds almost immediately. And it's in the mid 2010s it kind of hits its peak. Now, COVID again knocks it back down, but we've recovered.
Yep.
There's no evidence that industry has been hollowed out. There has been a decline in the number of people employed in industry, but a lot of that comes from better technology. Instead of sitting there on the assembly line, you now have machines that are much more efficient to do that. There's no unemployment crisis across the country. We've had relatively low unemployment, except for things like COVID. Except for things like the financial crisis over the past 20 years, unemployment otherwise has been very low. It's not like people are just scrambling to find a job and begging for the factory to come back and put them on an assembly line. And yet there's this myth, and the myth is often projected around other people. So you see all the voices in Washington that are touting this narrative um, have never worked a day in their lives in a factory.
Yep.
I mean, imagine Howard Lutnick working in a factory. I mean, he doesn't even know to describe what happens on the floor of a factory.
Yep.
Orrin Cass, who's this think tank advocate of tariffs and industrial policy and a big pusher of this narrative in D.C., is a Harvard-educated lawyer that comes from the bluest of the blue blood of New England. Like probably has never stepped in a parking lot of a factory before, and yet acts as if he's speaking on behalf of the beleaguered working class. It's like a right-wing vanguardism that's been asserted here. It's like we're the intellectuals, we know that you're suffering, and we're going to purport to speak on your behalf, whether you want it or not. And then they package that up in a mythology that appeals to voters for a variety of reasons.
Well, and sadly, it does appeal to voters because
Yeah,
both on the right and the left, we're seeing Bernie Sanders is still pretty popular, AOC.
exactly.
And then, of course, on the right, Trump wins. What is it about this message? I mean, what have we done wrong that, we fail to convince people of reality, of the facts
Yeah,
of
yeah.
reality, the truth about their own condition? I mean, they are convinced that they are worse
First
off,
off,
even
yeah.
though they're quite a bit better off.
Well, the other side is offering free candy and unicorns.
Yeah.
We're offering economic freedom. We're saying we're giving you the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of the market, including the unseen fruits. I mean, the fact that consumer goods are more affordable than they've ever been in human history, and abundance is more widespread than it's ever been in human history. It's just taken for granted. But a politician comes along and says, "Ah, well, I'll give you favors, and I'll make the government your friend, and it'll invest money in these things that you want, and you'll see returns. Just listen to me."
Yep.
It's always hard to argue against that as an electoral message.
It's pretty depressing.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah.
So, um, how surprised were you of how aggressive Trump has been with regards to tariffs?
So it's been alarming. I've got to say, my most optimistic like scenario that I thought was going to happen when he won is that we would get a repeat of his first term,
Hmm.
where he does engage in some pretty aggressive tariffs, but they're targeted against China. They're targeted in specific sectors.
Yep.
And Biden continued those policies. So I thought, okay, they're not great policies, but it'll be a continuation of the status quo. Then I start seeing some of the appointments he's rolling out in November and December of last year. You see Howard Lutnick, who's this like arch protectionist billionaire that has put himself again as one of these other vanguard types of the working class. It's just really bizarre.
Yeah.
Peter Navarro, who I frankly think is crazy. I
I knew
mean,
Peanut Navarro before 2016. I lived in Orange County, and he taught at the University
yeah, yeah.
of California, Irvine. And I used to say even back then, Peter Navarro found a shtick. He was the only economist who was against trade in the
Yep,
world.
yep.
So Fox or any other network wanted somebody who was against trade.
They call him up.
Navarro. So he was always in the studio. He was always taping stuff. I'd bump into him in recording studios.
Yeah.
But he was just an opportunist who figured out this little niche. And then I remember in 2016 when Trump, or 2017 when Trump appoints him, it's like, really?
That guy. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's the real problem with this White House is he's surrounded himself in an echo chamber of tariff protectionists, but they might be the only tariff protectionists in the econ profession.
Yep.
And there's J.D. Vance is certainly a big. I mean, he was another one of those members of the Senate. It's like Josh Hawley on steroids.
Yep.
Vance has this cultural narrative that the Midwest has been hollowed out by free trade and government needs to step in and correct it. He also thinks that he's got some weird anti-capitalistic moral views that are tied to some very extreme religious beliefs that he shares. You get some of the Eastern European post-liberalism movement. He's ideologically ingrained in that sort of stuff. And they make capitalism the scapegoat of their entire worldview.
Yeah, for him, it's very philosophical, I think. I agree.
Absolutely,
It's
absolutely.
he's a real nationalist, and he's an integral. He's influenced by Deneen and these guys.
Exactly. And they all think capitalism is like icky, it's immoral, it's dirty,
It's materialistic.
commodification, it taints the soul. It's kind of
Yeah.
it's a theological argument at its basis.
Yeah.
And it's also proffered by people who are frankly incompetent when it comes to understanding economic ideas.
Mhm.
Like they have no exposure to it. So they just make it up as they go. And I mean that in all seriousness. Ask one of them to explain the theory of comparative advantage. They bumble around and
Yeah.
get their words twisted. I mean, we even saw it this week. Ask them to explain how gross domestic product is calculated, and they have these weird ideas that the accounting offsets for trade to make it not gross national product but gross domestic product are like this operational mechanism that can be corrected with tariffs. It's just nuts.
So,
And
so,
it's
so yes.
amateur
So
mistakes.
imports actually reduce gross domestic product. That is,
That's the claim. That's the claim. And it's just strictly an accounting adjustment.
yep.
It's like macro econ 101. This is the thing you cover on like the second day of class, but they've never had that class and have rationalized their way to it because it seems to support the policy objective that they want.
Yeah. It's it's stunningly absurd.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so so yeah, he surrounded himself by these the few people who reject trade, and really there's nobody there that will stand up to him.
That's
What do you
exactly
think
it.
of Ian's asking if you've how much you know about Stephen Miran and his paper?
Oh boy.
They
Yeah.
use this guy to be structuring the global trading system. And what do you think of him? What's his background? Where did he come from? And
Yeah. So
yeah.
see, he actually comes out of a mainstream econ program. He's a Harvard PhD in econ, studies under Marty Feldstein, who's the Council of Economic Advisors guy under Reagan. It was generally a free market guy. So he didn't really have much of an academic profile prior to this. I think I first noticed him. He started bouncing around some of these ideas toward the end of the last Trump administration. He had been involved as like a Treasury official. So Stephen Miran, this paper he put out, this was one of the moments actually in, I think it was November or December, Trump announced him as the CEA chair. And first I'm like, wait, that guy? And then second, I start reading some of his papers and I was like, oh,
Mhm.
this is nuts. So what Miran did is he wrote this article, and it's referred to as the Mar-a-Lago Accord paper. He borrowed that name from, I think, some other economist that floated it. But he has this idea that the dollar is overvalued worldwide, and that is the mechanism that's the cause of our trade deficits. Now, he doesn't really explain or get into depth on why trade deficits are undesirable, other than
Yep.
Trump has said so. And I don't think Trump understands what a trade deficit is, frankly.
I'm not
I
sure he
make this
understands what a
joke.
trade is.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. But deficits sound bad, and they poll
Mhm.
very bad. I make this joke. You ask pollsters if they went around and asked the average American, should the United States maintain a capital account surplus? 75% would say yes.
Yep, absolutely.
And the capital account surplus is the other side of the trade deficit.
Yep.
It's like these policies, so it's that level of superficiality. But Myron thinks that trade deficits are bad. He also has some weird theories about how tariffs could replace income taxes as a revenue source. And then on top of this, he has this, frankly, kind of bonkers theory that the position of the dollar in the world, the strong position of the dollar in the world, is kind of like this global public goods curse on the United States that requires us to bear the burdens of all of these other things, both economically, and then it filters into like military spending. And again, it's like if your only tool is a tariff, everything looks like an industry to be protected. But he's got this idea here. But he's got a problem, a theoretical problem. Because if you impose tariffs against the world, that strengthens the position of the dollar vis-a-vis foreign currency units,
Hmm.
which is the absolute opposite direction of what he wants to go. So to get
Well,
around this,
as long as foreigners want to invest in the U.S.
exactly.
When they stop wanting to invest in
When
the
they
U.S.,
stop wanting to
they
invest in the
look for-
U.S., then well, then you start getting other problems.
yeah,
But if you have a caterus paribus is you'd have a dollar strengthening
yep,
effect from a
yep,
tariff, and he says,
yep.
well, this is a problem. We need to offset this through basically coaxing other countries into a currency revaluation on favorable terms to the U.S.
Wow.
And how do you do that? Well, this is the really bonkers part of the paper. He says, well, you start using tariffs as like this bludgeon. It's the stick and the carrot and stick approach. As we impose tariffs and bully people into accepting a preferential currency arrangement with the U.S., or maybe some of the more extreme versions of things that he's floated is you exchange short-term treasury bills for long-term century bonds, is one of the things that he calls them, at rates that are more favorable to the United States.
And you
Uh,
force people to buy them.
Force people to buy them. It's like if you don't buy them, we're going to offer you a deal you can't refuse, and that deal is either you buy them or you're going to get a tariff slapped on you. And this was the idea that's floated in this paper. And there you see elements have crept up in the White House of that paper being advanced, although they retreated from it because it sent the international currency markets and bond markets haywire a couple
Yep,
weeks ago.
yep.
Um, so they kind of said maybe we need to back away. But Myron gave a speech right after the Liberation Day tariff
Hmm.
announcement, and it's on the White House's website. And the speech is basically like a bullet pointed version of this paper he published last year. So I call these they're the rebalancer faction of the protectionists in the White House. And this is the other thing to understand about this current White House. Trump is surrounded by protectionists, but they're protectionists for about 5 or 6 different reasons. You have the classical Peter Navarro, just like cranky 19th century economics. We need to bolster industry. You have Lutnick, who keeps floating this idea that we're going to replace the IRS. You have J.D. Vance, who has like this cultural protectionism. You have the China hawks that want to leverage it in diplomatic for diplomatic leverage abroad to try to attain certain policy objectives in the foreign arena. Then you have these currency rebalancer people, which is where the faction that Myron comes from. Although J.D. Vance is also apparently sympathetic to this.
I'm sure.
That there was about 2 years ago, he was on a committee hearing with Jerome Powell, and I keep pointing people to look up this speech that he gives in front of Jerome Powell, and it is off the walls nuts. It's about how the dollar is America's curse, and it means that the rest of the world is taking advantage of us, and we need to weaken the dollar intentionally. Just off the wall stuff. And you're like, who on earth is advising this guy on his economic ideas? I mean, it reads like the Lyndon LaRouche blog in 1985.
I remember 1987, the Secretary of the United States went on the weekend and said we were going to weaken the dollar, and we got Black Monday as a consequence.
That's exactly, yeah. I mean, this is playing with fire.
5% in one day.
Yes, it is playing with fire, and that's why we saw the bond markets get spooked a couple weeks ago, and why we start to see the dollar. I mean, confidence in the dollar has fallen as a result of even floating these ideas. Now, I think fortunately some cooler heads have prevailed and they backed off of that one, but it's this seesaw where like one week the old school neo-mercantilist protectionists or have Trump's ear and he's going crazy haywire on all these extreme punitive protective rates. The other week it's like, oh no, let's leverage tariffs against China. Another week it's the rebalancers have his ear. And that's why you get this vacillation between extremely high tariffs that are enacted and then 2 days later they're paused. And then 3 days after that, another version's enacted. So it's just created this crazy uncertainty as all these tariff factions are fighting for his attention.
How much do you get a sense that, and I know this is pure speculation, how many of these people believe in this stuff, or is this
Yeah.
a power grab, trying to suck up to Trump? Because he hates
Yeah.
deficits in trade.
He hates deficits in trade.
And it's just an emotional thing, and he's not going to give it up. And they are just trying to rationalize it and give him the appearance of an intellectual excuse for it all.
So there is definitely that faction in the White House, and I think these are some of the leveler heads on it. So Kevin Hassett is chair of the National Economics Council. He
doesn't believe in
be a free market guy, and I think he's kind of sold himself this line. Well, yes, we're just doing this for strategic leverage reasons, and I mean he's even gone on the media and said, but the goal is we can get other countries to lower their barriers against us, and we'll get free trade in the end. I think that's a pipe dream, and I absolutely believe that Kevin Hassett knows better than the policies he's advocating. At the same time, I would rather have him have the president's ear than Stephen Miran or Howard Lutnick or J.D. Vance, who are pushing these much more radical pro-tariff agendas.
And you think they believe them?
Because I actually do think that, so Navarro is an ideologue on this.
Yeah.
Lutnick, I think, doesn't understand what trade is, but he absolutely believes this. J.D. Vance has an even more superficial understanding of trade, but has almost like this theological attachment to capitalism is icky, and we need to do things to purify it and bring industry home. And you see that in his speeches. I mean, it's a very moralizing crusade against capitalism from the right. I mean, some of these things, they sound like right-wing Marxists in a weird way.
They do. I mean, they talk about exploitation. They talk about the same kind of, the same kind of stuff, and they're trying to appeal to the same type of people that the Marxists tried to appeal to.
Yeah, and they're the vanguard. And again, J.D. Vance, although he brags that he's from the humble upbringing in the Midwest, but I mean, here's a guy that's the elite of the elite, Harvard educated or Yale educated lawyer, ends up going into venture capital, best-selling author. He's very far away from those Midwestern roots that he seems to be building on it. But it's like this right-wing vanguardism of purporting to speak on behalf of the workers. And there's the other interesting twist, because even though this appeals at the polls when you're offering favors to people, tariffs themselves are facing a huge backlash.
Yeah.
J.D. Vance may be the most unpopular major politician in America today. Like he trails behind Trump. He trails behind basically the entire White House. Same with the poll questions on what's the approval rating for the Trump tariff policy. It's trailing by double digits. You ask average Americans, do you think tariffs will help or hurt you? And it's in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% are saying hurt you.
Yeah.
15% are saying they think that tariffs will help you.
It's quite surprising.
These are atrocious poll numbers.
Yeah. It's quite
and that just tells me like
people get it.
Yeah. Well, they're seeing prices are going up at the stores.
Yep.
I mean, at the end of the day, these are a tax increase, and you can't hide a tax increase.
Yeah.
It's
So how do you think this, I mean, do you have any sense of how this plays out? Are they going to stick to this?
yeah,
We've got
yeah,
the 90-day, and then something happens after 90 days. And, he keeps saying, I'm going to lower tariffs on China, but he hasn't done it yet.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there's supposed to be a deal with China, the
yeah.
Chinese don't seem in a hurry to actually sign.
So I think there are
We'll
enough
see.
ideologues in the White House that are going to keep it going for far longer than it should.
Yep.
And plus, Trump has his own natural inclination is toward tariffs. But Trump is also a fairly savvy politician. I'll give him that credit. And
Mhm.
he's also known for pivoting, doing a complete 180 on an issue and pretending as if nothing had ever changed. And
Declaring
weirdly,
victory. Yeah.
he manages to sell that message. But whenever and then the one other thing about Trump, he has a long history of throwing people under the bus and blaming them
Yep.
for mistakes of his administration, up to and including senior cabinet officials, previous vice presidents.
Sure.
So I think no one is immune from this. And if Trump sees that like his presidency is being jeopardized by like an imminent recession, I think there is a chance he starts looking for an off ramp. And part of that off ramp will be backing down from some of the most extreme versions of the policy. The other part of the off ramp will be picking a fall guy,
Yep.
and throwing that person under the bus in a
Yep.
very public way, as Trump is prone to do.
Yep.
The other thing I could see happening, and this is what really alarms me as a constitutionalist, all of these tariffs have been enacted through emergency presidential decree.
Yep.
Not a single vote in Congress. Go read the Constitution. The tariff power belongs to Congress, and revenue bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Under no conceivable interpretation of the Constitution that's actually grounded in his text is anything that he's doing right now legal or constitutional.
Hmm.
And in fact, the statute he's invoking doesn't even mention the word tariffs. Now we have, fortunately, that there have been several lawsuits filed by people that have been affected by tariffs, challenging the constitutionality of this. And if originalism is indeed as strong as we've been led to believe it is on the Supreme Court, I don't see the court buying a lot of the administration's arguments for this expansive unilateral tariff power. I'm cautiously optimistic that we may get a court ruling knocking off all of this nonsense and just declaring it unconstitutional.
That'd be amazing. It could take a few months, I guess,
Yes, yeah,
maybe till the fall to get actually
yeah,
to the Supreme Court. I think the first hearing is in front of one of the courts is on May 12th or
right,
13th.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But yes, that is a hope because it clearly should be, just like today, I guess a judge ruled that they can't use the Alien Enemies
Yeah,
Act
exactly,
against people who are not enemies because we're not at war.
exactly, exactly.
Maybe they can. Maybe they'll also.
It's like reclaiming constitutional powers here. I mean, if you think of it, the president couldn't just decree tomorrow that we have universal health care for all.
No.
Although Joe Biden and Barack Obama probably wanted to do that, but even they wouldn't go that far. So why can Trump declare, I'm going to just rewrite the entire tariff schedule of the United States on a personal whim without any legislative oversight? It's frankly offensive to a system of rule of law that
Absolutely.
that type of a policy could even be countenanced.
Yeah. So, do you think we're going to get any deals?
I'm very skeptical. I know the White House is claiming that they're getting deals out of this, but it's kind of like that they say, oh well, 80 countries have come to us, and can you name the countries?
Yeah.
They won't name them.
No.
That tells me they don't have a deal. Um,
And the Japanese went home, I understand.
exactly. And I think and this has been one of the strategic missteps. It was such a haphazard rollout of this policy that so maybe back in late January, early February, Trump could have tried a carefully tailored. I mean, I disagree with the method, but at least there was some conceivable case. It says I'm trying to get leverage to get the EU to maybe lower its agriculture tariffs or something like that. But he has blown his political capital by all this vacillation basically other countries do not trust us anymore
Mhm.
because it's been this seesaw back and forth. And I don't think he has the discipline to actually carry through on a deal of this type when the trust has already expired.
Yep.
So like that ship has long sailed, and it's going to be very, very hard to recover and even get back to the position he was in January and February.
So, what do you think this does? So, we'll get to the US in a minute, but what do you think? How bad is this for China?
Well, trade wars are never good for either
It's
party to
lose
that.
lose. Yep.
Yeah, it's a lose-lose. It's a race to the bottom. So certainly they do feel some of the effects of that. Although the incidence of the tax itself tends to fall on domestic consumers, so we feel a very pronounced effect of it. One of the things that I am somewhat concerned about in the China situation, China will definitely spin this and propagandize it as if they're the victims
Hmm.
of this war that the United States initiated against them without provocation or cause. Now, you could argue that on other margins, China has been a bad actor. They even engage in currency manipulation. They've been a bad actor in that domain as well.
As
Uh,
I always say, as if we don't,
if
right?
we don't, right,
As if
right.
we don't, manipulate our currency. That's what the Fed does when they
Yeah,
meet and
that's
intimidate
exactly
countries.
it. I mean, this is why, like, the answer to Steve Miran's papers, all this is not to coax people into currency deals. It's to depoliticize the central bank, get it out of the currency manipulation business,
Yeah.
maybe even abolish it outright. I mean,
Abolishing it
that's the
would be good. Yes.
yeah,
That's a
yeah,
little
it's
radical.
going the other direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, but China now, because they can play themselves as the victim, weirdly, it's created leverage that they did not have prior to this trade war starting
Mhm.
for them because they can reach out to other countries as well. And that this is the sheer stupidity of the Trump tactic. If he had a narrow targeted policy against China, why are you putting tariffs on Canada and Mexico?
Yeah.
Peaceful trading partners that were geopolitically aligned with us for the most part, and also had geopolitical concerns about China. This is like sending other countries running into China's arms because you've just needlessly provoked and
And even worse,
attacked.
it's Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea.
Right, right.
You know?
Like people that other countries that were in a somewhat adversarial position toward China now have a reason to deal with China because the United States has declared a trade war on them for no good reason, no apparent reason. And that's again, it's like back to the race to the bottom. It's just a very bad strategy for achieving anything that Trump claims he wants.
Yep.
And he's getting a lot of really bad advice if he thinks that this is going to yield the results that he expects.
And it seems that it's just going to increase nationalism in China,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is a dangerous force long term.
Yeah, yeah, you know, it's the old saying, and I think sometimes it's attributed to Bastiat, so that when goods cease to cross borders, armies do. I mean, peaceful trade relations are one of the mechanisms that reinforces global safety and security.
Yep.
And when they fall apart, suddenly military options become a much more viable tool because there's no longer a market that you could risk losing.
Now, what do you think about the arguments about national security and the need to be able to produce in the United
Yeah.
States some of the things that today we rely almost totally on China?
So I think there are other policies that could be adopted to incentivize this. So obviously, I don't want to outsource our nuclear weapon technology to China.
Hmm.
And there's some things on the, sensitive microchips, sensitive computing parts, uh, certain very, very narrow technological uh, tools and items I think certainly fall under a security based case. But this comes into, there are other ways to do this besides building giant tariff walls. Why not reform government procurement policies? Uh, why not put certain types of classification on certain types of technology to where the way that it's produced, the contract to produce a military good can specifically come from the United States. Now, this is open to cronyism because it moves from the advanced supercomputer chip is a sensitive military technology, and then a few months later, it's like whoever's making the canteens and lunch boxes for the army are also sensitive military technology. So there is a risk there, and that cronyism needs to be guarded against as well. But again, that's an easier problem to solve than massive tariffs.
Sure.
So it's just the wrong instrument for those goals is basically what it comes down to at the end of the day. And then the other thing you can do, a diversified stream of essential resources is better than a unitary stream.
Yep.
It's actually good that we get energy. We are engaged in an energy trade with Canada.
Mm-hmm.
It's good that we're engaged in a steel and aluminum trade with Canada and Mexico. These are friendly neighbors, and it means that there are multiple sources from a good that we also do produce quite a bit of domestically.
Yep.
If you were to get into a war, I would hope that our neighbors would be on the same side during that war, and I would hope that those exchanges would continue to occur across borders.
Absolutely.
I'd rather that be the case than to get into a war where we've angered and isolated ourselves from the entire world under this crazy quest to just produce everything internally.
Yeah, it's insane. So, what do you think the impact is going to be on the U.S. economy? So we just got a negative GDP number.
Yep.
It's very small and it'll probably be revised. But what do you expect? This quarter is going to be the quarter where we start seeing
the effects.
The second quarter. What do you expect the numbers to come in for the rest of the year?
Well, this is the great uncertainty. So we know from the stock markets abhor uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Bad policies, they're absorbed and they do take a hit from bad policies as well. If you tax something, it's not going to be good for the market. But if the tax is an on again, off again light switch, what that just means is people sit on their money or they delay decisions until they know the outcome.
Yep.
And that's the real risk we're running into with these tariff policies. You can look at the stock market down to the day that every time Trump announced a tariff between January and now, the stock market plummets immediately. And then he backs off and it rebounds, and it plummets, then it rebounds. This is an acute self-inflicted harm. Does that eventually start translating into broader economic output? Does it translate into consumption patterns? It absolutely will if you are starting to delay decisions at companies on what to produce and how much to produce and what their outlook is on the future. Statistics that I see underappreciated in this discussion is most domestic produced goods have some sort of an input, whether it's raw material or a part that comes from abroad.
Yep.
So you can have a factory in Ohio or South Carolina or Tennessee that's it's an American factory making American goods, but they're getting parts from Mexico. They're getting chips from Taiwan. They're getting aluminum from Canada. And tariffs are going to affect their own costs, including what they can anticipate producing 6 months from now or a year from now. It's all it's almost like a self-imposed COVID lockdown style effect on supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you start getting into some real problems. And those repercussions occur, they're a couple weeks to a couple months after the initial shock. So I think this is it's approaching on the horizon. We're going to start seeing some of the effects of the tariffs that are already in place on disrupting supply chains or causing raw material inputs from abroad to go up, and that alters the production decisions of a U.S.-based company that can no longer afford to produce as many units of whatever it makes than it would have under the previous input prices.
And does that create unemployment?
Absolutely will. I think there have been some hiring pauses at U.S.-based auto manufacturers because they're afraid they can't get parts. They're delaying production decisions. So we're already starting to see kind of the soft unemployment effects. And if this goes into a full-fledged, trade war with major supply chain disruptions, unemployment becomes an acute problem. So it's like even though this populist message is tailored toward labor, labor is not necessarily a beneficiary of tariffs. It's often it's in a very ambiguous position. both on the effects of what that does for production and their jobs, and also spending habits. If a worker in a steel mill is now faced with double the budget cost of just household items, clothing, food, and goods that they get at their Walmart, it might be a situation that puts them economically worse off than any gain that their protected industry gets from the tariff.
Yeah, absolutely. And then do you expect to see empty shelves in a few weeks?
I think we'll start to see some very early signs of them. I don't think it's going to be like the COVID, suddenly everything's under lockdown and you can't ship anything anywhere and everyone runs and grabs all the toilet paper.
Mhm.
But I think you start to see bits and pieces around the edges of the economy start to become more expensive or are no longer stocked at a ready supply. And it turns out it's because they were on a ship coming from China that the order was canceled a month ago because of the tariff cost, and it takes a month to transit the Panama Canal and get it over to the United States, and we just now are starting to incur some of the effects of that. So yeah, there's a lag of the policies that are already in place. There is a lag of effect, and if Trump, after his 90-day pause, resumes some of the insanity, even if he partially resumes it, that
Yeah.
only exacerbates the lag.
And this 10% flat tariff,
Yeah.
if he doesn't resume the craziness, but just keeps the
Yeah.
10%, how bad is that?
It's one of the largest peacetime tax hikes that we've ever had in the
Yeah.
20th or 21st centuries.
Yeah.
Um, I put this before Trump took office, the average U.S. tariff rate had been hovering around 1 to 3% overall on all goods. And if we're jacking that up overnight to 10%, this moves us from the lower end of the developed world. It moves us from just a little bit behind the EU and Great Britain and Canada to now we're in the same territory of average tariff rate applied by Zimbabwe or Cuba or Venezuela or some of these just economic basket cases of the 20th and 21st century. I mean, this is third world dictatorship style fiscal policy. There's certainly no other developed economy on earth that has tariffs that high if it's a uniform 10%. It also illustrates the ratchet effect of this. Trump goes extreme and then walks it back to something lower, but still it's higher than we previously had.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, he's talking about lowering the Chinese tariff from 145 to 60.
yeah, yeah,
It's still massive.
yeah, still massive because 145 to 60, well, 3 months ago, we had barely any tariff at all.
Yeah.
And we've
Yeah.
still got them now. So it's just a massive tax hike. It's like I'm going to raise your income tax rate to 90%, and then as a gift to you, lower it to 60%. I'm still much worse off.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone would stand for that if that was income tax policy. So why should we stand for it if it's tariff policy?
Absolutely. Let's see. Shazbud asks if you had a time machine,
Yeah.
what historical economic data would you want to uncover?
Wow. Wow. Yeah. If I could go back to the early founding years of the Republic, because unfortunately we didn't keep records on trade.
Yep.
In that era, it has to be reconstructed and inferred from like shipping records and things like that. I would want to know, what's the equivalent of the trade barrier that existed on the United States at its founding when we declared independence? Because one of the reasons we declared independence is Britain had imposed these navigation acts and all these other taxes and restrictions on our trade and commerce.
Hmm.
For a brief time, they even shut down the entire port of Boston. It's like an extreme mercantile protectionist retaliatory measures. And that's what drove us to independence. I would like to know the data that underlie some of those policies and how that shaped the early republic's thinking on free trade, because there is an ethos of free trade that's adhered to by almost every major figure of that era except for Alexander Hamilton.
So he was not a free trader?
He was definitely not a free trader.
Okay.
But he's not a high tariff guy in the Henry Clay sense. So he's more protectionist than most of his peers, but he's not like adopt these obscene
Yep.
60 or 145% tariff rates. He would think that's crazy because he wants federal revenue to come in, and if you raise the tariff rate that high, it becomes punitive and it actually eats away at revenue.
Jennifer asks, "What do you have you heard of some people confusing the federal deficit with the trade deficit?"
Yeah. I've seen signs the President of the United States makes that confusion from time to
Yeah.
time. You see that in this rhetoric, him and Vance in particular. They talk about other countries are ripping us off,
Yeah.
and they'll say we're $36 trillion in debt, and it's because Canada has been ripping us off. And it's like there's no connection here in the way that they're asserting it. They just hear the term deficit and assume that there's some sort of interrelationship. What it gets back down to is just the abject economic ignorance that seems to be percolating around this White House. That they just confuse basic terms. It's the same people that are mistaking the GDP formula. It's the same people that have like these Peter Navarro style uh, theories of what tariffs can do. It's innumeracy overlaid with economic illiteracy, I know I sound harsh on this, but I have very little patience for that because it's like an economic Luddism that they've
Yeah.
embraced.
What do you think of the argument? I think Peter Schiff makes this
Yeah,
that the trade deficit's bad because it's a reflection of the fact that we are borrowing money. We're living on borrowed money. That
sure,
is, we
sure.
don't actually create a lot of value. We borrow money from the rest of the world and we spend it
Yeah,
on
yeah,
inputs.
yeah. So certainly there are, like there are treasury bills that are held by foreign governments.
Hmm.
That's absolutely the case. I'd say the international monetary system is less than ideal, and basically has been ever since the world went off the gold standard.
Yep.
And that opens opportunities for some bad behavior in there. I don't think it's as big of a problem as an alarmist would say on that. And I'll credit. So Peter Schiff has actually been pretty critical of the Trump administration
Yes,
on
he has.
tariff.
Very, very.
So I think he's aware that yes, this is a component of a larger debt problem that the U.S. government has. But the end of the day, this is a spending problem.
Yes,
Foreign
absolutely.
countries hold a portion of our debt because we spend too much.
Yep.
It's not foreign countries hold a portion of our debt because we trade too much. That's nonsensical.
Yep.
It's
And he wouldn't say that. And
yeah,
it's a,
exactly,
it's a
exactly.
symptom, not a cause. But but it is also true that there's a reason why foreigners hold our debt is because they still think it's one of the best assets to
Yeah,
hold in the world.
exactly,
So as
exactly.
much debt as we've taken on, they still think we're good for it. Maybe they're wrong,
Right, right.
but
And that's where you get some of these crazy schemes about like trying to coax people into exchanging treasuries for
yeah,
bonds on worse terms.
yeah.
It's kind of like this actually destabilizes the dollar. We started to see, I think, some signs of that effect a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
And I don't know what went on in some of those closed rooms, but it certainly spooked the markets.
Well, it definitely. I know a lot of investors, and there was a lot of people panicking,
Yeah, yeah.
because everything was moving in ways that we've been taught in finance shouldn't be
It
moving.
shouldn't happen. Yeah,
Interest rates going up and the dollar going down does not consistently
yeah.
is not supposed to happen.
So
Uh,
yeah, it's
but,
back to they're playing with fire.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
yes,
Richard says,
good burn.
if the Fed is abolished, don't we run the risk of the Treasury Department directly manipulating the currency?
Well, that's why we have to, I think, be very, very careful what we
Yes.
do. If we abolish the central bank, handing it over to the Treasury Department is like the absolute worst option.
Yeah.
Politicizes it first. That just brings the what little independence the central bank currently has in-house, and it's the whims of politics. This is Peronist Argentina style
Yep.
governance. This is why I think you need something like a gold standard, whether it's a direct exchange, I mean, there are other ways, mechanisms you can have a partial tie to a commodity that could be implemented. There are other ways that you can also insulate through rule mechanisms the central bank
Mhm.
and take away its power. I think the central bank, the Federal Reserve, has crept into areas that were never intended or contemplated when it was created, or even as recently as 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, why is the Federal Reserve researching climate change policy?
Yep.
Why did the Biden era Federal Reserve appointments get into DEI initiatives? Uh, Even the
Well, even bank
traditional,
regulations, it
yeah,
certainly wasn't when it was established supposed to be a bank regulator.
yeah, a lender of last resort,
Yep.
bank regulator, and then it was added to a price stability mandate was added in there.
Yep.
And it's like the one thing that it's actually been horrible at is price stability, but that should be its core mandate. And I think it's because there are other political objectives that have been put in place there. I mean, the classical gold standard, the strongest argument for it was always that gold is hard to politically manipulate.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a fixed material. It comes out of the ground. It's rare. You have to put in the work to pull it out of the ground. And yes, gold prices change, but it removes it several steps from the fingers of politicians unless they start legislatively fixing exchanges of other things to gold. And that's
Which
where the
they've
currency
done.
manipulation occurs.
They have a long history of doing, but
Which they do. Exactly,
yeah. No,
exactly.
I think, Richard, when we talk about ending the Fed, I think most of it doesn't mean moving it to another department of government. It means, in a sense, privatizing it, but through a
Right, yeah.
banking system and a gold
Yeah.
standard. And then you don't need a Fed. You have private money
Yeah.
and competition over that private money. So,
And we had periods in the 19th century. They're not credit. Somehow tariffs are the cause of prosperity of the 19th century, but not the relatively free banking system we had before the Civil War, or not even the gold standard system that we had after the Civil War.
yeah,
It's
it's amazing. Hey, Michael asks, is there a greater than 50% chance these tariffs get repealed in full?
That I don't see that happening as long as Trump is president, unfortunately. I don't think we're going to get back to where we were in January 2025. We could de-escalate, but the man likes tariffs, and if he does back away from them, he's going to call it a victory of some sort to get that lower level, but still higher than it was tariff rate in place. And that might be his attempted off ramp. It's like, well, okay, we'll get rid of the 60% tariffs and we'll back it down to 10%, or we'll get rid of the 10% tariffs and we'll back it down to 5%. He's going to want to do that. And I guess there's one other option, though, that could blow this all up, and that's the Supreme Court strikes it down,
Yes. Yes, that's right. Wow.
which I think would be the ideal scenarios. I'm hoping the court goes big and just says, no, Mr. President, you do not have this power. Everything you've just done under this is null and void.
It would be pretty amazing. I mean, it would be fascinating to see what happens politically if they do that. I hope they do it.
Yep.
I mean, MAGA will go nuts.
They'll go nuts. But again, go back to the polling. It's like
Yep.
less than 30% of the
It
population is
might
on
save them.
board. Yeah.
It might save them. Yeah.
Yeah, it might save the Republicans' electoral chances in 2026.
Yep.
So if they stay on this course, I mean, they're headed to a Smoot Hawley style defeat, I think.
Yeah. The only thing is in the Republicans' favor is the Democrats.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
It's such a mess. Michael asks, what do you think the chances are of a major recession in the next 3 to 6 months?
Ooh, so all the prognosticators have dramatically raised the probability of a recession. So these are the major banks, major financial houses that do private prognostication. Because back in January, it was seen as a slim, existent but very distant chance. Uh, we do have a much higher chance of a self-induced recession, especially if the GDP numbers from earlier this week hold up. We've already got 1 quarter of actual contraction. If we get another quarter or two of contraction, then that's when the panic button needs to be hit.
All right. So what is the main argument against the idea that tariffs allow us to reshore manufacturing jobs?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's back to just how globally integrated our economy is. Again, if 60% of the things that are made in the United States use an imported raw material or component or part from abroad, reshoring that is basically a pipe dream. Because you're not reshoring at that point. You're trying to impose internal autarky, like a North Korea style
Yeah. Yeah.
system of self-sufficiency. I think it's just rooted in like a classical misunderstanding of what trade is and what trade does.
Hmm.
Like U.S. businesses, by and large, are stronger precisely because they have
Oh,
access to
absolutely.
cheaper materials abroad.
Hmm.
So anyone that thinks that we're going to reshore and make U.S. industry stronger, they're missing the whole part of the picture that U.S. industry attained its strength from the fact that it could exchange abroad.
Yeah. So Blaze asks, many historians argue that the U.S. became a world superpower because of free federal education that started in the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah.
To what extent do you think that is true?
I mean, I'm skeptical of that because it's so limited in the 19th century. So the Morrill Act passes, I think it's 1864, and that establishes the land grant colleges. Which are there's federal funding for certain types of universities, but universities are really an elite institution until after World War II. It's really the GI Bill and that whole era and the Higher Education Act in the 1960s that you start getting mass attendance and at universities, like it becomes an accessible thing, university degree for the broad swaths of the public.
What about public education for, kids for,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but again, we go back, look at the 19th century. States that had public education, some of them had like voucher-like mechanisms. It's a very mixed history of, essentially 50 different experiments
yeah,
playing out because so much of it's at the state or local level. Uh, I think the federal government did get involved in K through 12 education very aggressively in the late 20th century,
yeah,
and it's just been a bureaucratic disaster.
yeah, yeah,
So you no longer have that experimentation of slightly different systems between the states that you did get in the 19th century
yeah.
and early 20th century.
Um, so if the Supreme Court strikes down these tariffs, do they strike down the ones that I forget the act that he uses
Yeah, it's the IEEPA. It's one of the presidential emergency powers.
so you wouldn't strike down though like the steel tariffs and
Yeah.
the auto tariffs, or would it? Like, did you
So
use
the
that act for
existing
those as
ones,
well?
yeah, yeah. So this goes deep into Supreme Court history. In 1928 was the very first case on the delegation of the tariff power from Congress to the executive branch.
Hmm.
And the Supreme Court heard this case. It's a similar question. It's like, can Congress give up its power?
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court rules, yes, they can, but there has to be a defined, intelligible principle of why they're doing so. In other words, they have to lay out guidelines for the bureaucrats.
Yep.
And what Congress did at the time and why those tariffs were sustained is they specified a regulatory procedure. Like the successors of that era of case law, there's something known as a Section 301 tariff. You have all these clauses that are written elsewhere into the federal code that they allow if the conditions of dumping are met abroad, you can invoke X type of tariffs. If there's a certain economic threat to a specific industry from abroad, you can adopt another set of tariffs. If there's a defined national security need, you can adopt another set of tariffs. And a lot of these things are deeply politicized. They're superficial regulatory requirements, but they're regulatory requirements nonetheless. And what it means is the president can't just on a random Tuesday decree them. The
Hmm.
president say, I'm going to invoke an anti-dumping clause tariff. What he does is he'll tell the U.S. Trade Representative or the Commerce Department, whoever the governing regulatory bodies happen to be, that they have to assemble a team of economists to investigate this, and it has to go through a regulatory review period, and
Okay.
it has to take testimony from the industries. So it's like a couple months of bureaucratic hurdles. Now they're normally rubber stamped and just kind of shoved through, but those bureaucratic hurdles exist to meet the specific delegated principles of Congress.
Yep.
The IEEPA tariffs don't have any of that. It's just the
Yeah.
whim of the president. He's basically
Yep.
saying, I can do whatever I want and call it an emergency.
Yep.
And that's why I think it's constitutionally vulnerable in the way that some of these others are not.
Good. And in his first term, he didn't use the IEPA
No, he used the
regulatory
more
mechanism.
conventional
Yep.
clauses, and that's why the rollout was so much slower. They did have the regulatory review period, and it says, okay, well, you have to have like 30 days of to collect comments, and you have to bring the economist
Yeah.
in to issue a report. It's like going through the motions, but nonetheless, that is itself an obstacle.
Hmm.
At least, unfortunately, I mean, I still think that Congress delegates too much of its powers, but at least there's a plausible case that
Yep.
they're following the letter on that or following Supreme Court precedent where there's no case at all that IEPA is constitutionally sanctioned or sound. Uh,
Well,
that
Phil, I
fortunately
know
doesn't
you have
stop our judges.
a hard stop, and this has been great. I really
Oh,
appreciate this. Yeah, this.
absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank
Happy
you
to do
for
it.
giving the time. Thanks you guys for asking questions, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Phil, hopefully we'll meet up somewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Look, thanks a lot.
All right.
See you
Take
soon.
care.
Bye. Have a good night.